In this module, we're going to be discussing a lot of different group components because at this point in the semester, you have learned how to build a speech, how to organize it, cite sources, all of that. So now you get to work in teams, which most people don't enjoy doing, but at some point you will have to work in teams, whether it's at work, school, wherever. So the first part I'm going to talk about is a little bit from chapter 10, or actually all of chapter 10, which is collaborating in teams. You want to be what's called a team, which every organization wants something called emotional intelligence from their employees. This was actually rated one of the top 5 skills in the workplace that employers were looking for last year. So you want to have the ability to interact well with others, not just by yourself. This increases organizational climate, so makes you happier at work, and also increases those positive relationships that you have with one another. And you know those people that you work with now or those classmates that you have now that are easy to get along with. That's part of emotional intelligence is having that interpersonal relationship with someone and feeling like you can confide in them as well as work well with them. So what makes a team? There is a difference between a group and a team, and I'm not really going to go into too much detail, but teams are interdependent. They rely on one another. And I want you to get in the habit of relying on your group members because you're all getting the same grade for the group, minus how you evaluate one another. So let's say team member A does a really great job, but team member B doesn't. You're going to get the same speech grade, but depending on how well you work, your group members' evaluation of you can affect your overall grade. So all 4 of your group members may get an A and you might get a B just because you were that one group member that didn't work well. So I want you to have those clear and inspiring goals from the beginning. And it may be to get an A or it may be just to get a good grade on this speech. Get stuff done. You will be meeting in a collaborate session to work with each other. So make sure you use this effectively. You'll have an hour and you can work more than just that hour. So someone rise as a leader. That's the very last one on this slide is principled leadership. Typically, this is your textbook talks about a designated leader and an emergent leader. Most of the time in classes, you have that one group member that stands out or that one that takes initiative. So they kind of become the leader without being designated the official leader. Competent team members, so having knowledge, choosing topics that really everyone can get on board with, not choosing a topic that only one person in the group likes. That can help with competency. Being unified in your commitment too. So maybe you're going to designate 2 hours a week to work on this or 2 hours a day, whatever it might be. Make sure that you're all committed. One thing that typically effective groups do is they have a standard of norms or excellence. So you have these expectations that, okay, if group member A doesn't come to our collaborate meetings, then we're going to dock them 5 points on the evaluation. Or if they maybe don't contribute to the outline or the PowerPoint portion, your group has to set those norms or expectations early. Like I said earlier, typically you have an emergent leader within groups. There are different perspectives on leadership in communication theory. The first is that there's a trait approach, and this is saying that you are born an effective leader. Most of the time, that is not the case, that there are those certain skills that every leader has. Well, those of you that have been in the workforce for a little bit or even a long time have known you have a boss that you love and those that you don't love, or you get along with well and those that you don't. And they're all different types of leaders. That's where the styles approach comes in. And this you typically see more in organizations. You have the authoritarian leader that's going to just tell you what to do and expect it to get done versus the democratic leader that might designate certain tasks but isn't going to hover over you. I call the authoritarian leader a lot of times too the micromanager, that person who always wants to know that you're getting things done and getting them done on time. Versus the exact opposite of both of those, the laissez-faire leader, the one who doesn't do anything or doesn't supervise. And those of you who have had this kind of a boss know that organizations typically are chaotic when you don't have a leader. Or maybe there's multiple leaders that kind of have emerged taking over. Well, then you have that conflict with the group members or coworkers that you're working with. There are also some contingency approaches. Your textbook doesn't talk too much about these, but I like talking about the leader member relations and life cycle theory. Leader member relations is saying that this is a leadership that bases their style off of their relationship with those below them. This can be a good thing and a bad thing. This is where a lot of times those feelings of, well, they like that employee better than me, or they're not a fair leader. That's why sometimes this always isn't the best approach to a leadership style versus the life cycle theory, which this is one of my favorites. This is saying that you change as a leader over time. Same with any industry you're in. Typically, you improve as the years go on. So guess what? Your leadership style 5 years ago is not going to be the same as it is now. I personally was a manager at a gym that taught gymnastics for a while. And now, if I were to go back, I would be a completely different person because I started there over 10 years ago working versus all the things I've learned now. So that's where the life cycle theory approach to leadership comes into play. So, and this isn't necessarily going to emerge within your group presentations, but be aware of it on the workplace or in the workplace. The last thing I'm going to talk about from chapter 10 is avoiding excessive conformity. You want your group to be cohesive and get along well, but there is what's called too much conformity. And that's where groupthink comes in. This is a theory that talks about how we all jump on board because one person thinks it's a good idea. Well, this isn't always a good thing. Same with risky shift, taking a stance or doing something that you normally wouldn't do. And this happens a lot of times in the workplace. So, maybe everyone's going to invest in this big project. Well, you're normally that budgeter who isn't going to invest that much money into something. But groupthink happens all the time where even maybe your group gets together outside, like in person, and that football game is on. Well, guess what? 4 out of the 5 members want to watch it, so you do too. So be aware of that. It typically happens the longer you've worked with a group and the longer over time that you have worked with a group as well. So the next part I want to talk about, this is your special topics chapter. I'm only going to talk a little bit about the conflict management styles. So with groups come conflict, of course, and there can be different reasons for conflict. Maybe you're having a disagreement over what topic you're going to choose. Maybe it's the process, how you're going to lay out the speech organization. Maybe you're arguing over who's going to do the intro, who's going to do the close, and vice versa. Sometimes they can just be as simple as relational issues. You don't get along well with that person. Typically, this comes with genders too. Sometimes we think, well, I work better with males than females and vice versa. Or it could just be an ego or an identity issue. Maybe that person has put too much input in and you already don't like them. Well, try to let those go for now and get as much done on your group presentation as you possibly can. But these will happen in the workplace as well. That's typically reasons for them. Now, ways to combat those conflicts you have at work. Accommodating is one where one party sacrifices something in return for another. So for your group presentation, maybe you really wanted to do the PowerPoint, but group member B is also really good at PowerPoint. So guess what? You're going to give up the PowerPoint and let that group member do it. Well, that's you sacrificing something. Versus compromising is where both sacrifice something. So group member A decides, okay, well, instead of just giving you the PowerPoint to do, why don't we split it in half? And that way you both win. So it's a win-win situation, whereas accommodating is kind of a win-lose situation. Avoiding, of course, is a lose-lose because you never really resolve the problem. You just avoid it completely, which a lot of us do that, especially with trivial conflicts that we have. Maybe your roommate or husband or wife didn't take out the trash. Well, guess what? I'm just going to avoid bringing it up because it's not important. Versus competing. That's where we tend to be aggressive in our communication. And sometimes this can be a bad thing. But when you're in a group, or this happens more in the workplace, when you're competing for those raises, you have to use this type of management style to get what you want done. The very last one is collaborating. And this is technically what researchers say you want to do in a group is all come together and make a mutually exclusive decision, not anyone give up anything in return for something else. But it's very hard to do. So it's coming together and talking it out. So those are some ways or conflicts that you may have and ways to deal with those conflicts. The last thing I want to talk about is actually delivering the group presentation. So when you're organizing it, you can do it in different formats. So there's what's called a bookend, which I on this slide refer to as a spokesperson, a bookend presentation, or you can do like a panel presentation. One thing to know is that in a group, you're going to have your main introduction and your main conclusion. But as you transition between speakers, each one of you needs a little mini introduction to your part and a mini conclusion. That doesn't mean preview everything. That just means introduce the topic that you're going to talk about. For example, if you're doing the problem that, that Lubbock or Levelland or South Plains has, you're just briefly going to say, I'm going to talk about the problem. And then in the end, you're going to say, now that I've talked about the problem, I'm passing it over to Michael, who's going to talk about the solution. It's as simple as that. Online settings, you really can't have a spokesperson, but in person, you can have that one person that introduces everyone, that gets up in between each different part and then sits back down. Typically, this person will also do the introduction and the conclusion. And lastly, transitions. Always know who is speaking after you and what they're speaking about. So those are just some little tips for planning your introduction and conclusion in a group presentation. Lastly, I want to talk about delivering your group presentation. You want to make sure that you've practiced it extensively. Consider how you're going to set it up, the order in which you're going to present, how you'll be standing as you present this, or is everyone going to be sitting? In this setting online, you're going to be sitting, of course, but think about it if you were in a face-to-face class. How are you going to go about delivering that presentation? The other thing is make sure you're paying attention when your other group members are presenting. You're not frantically moving papers around and making a bunch of noise in the background or looking at your phone. All of those are distractions. And this is for in a face-to-face class setting or class. You would want to make sure you speak to the audience and not to your fellow group members. Sometimes we've practiced it and rehearsed it so much with one another that we tend to look at each other instead of looking at the group members or instead of looking at the audience. The other thing I want to mention before I go is always put a strong speaker for your introduction and conclusion. Sometimes we tend to think, well, that's the smallest section, so we're going to give it to the person who's our weakest speaker or weakest presenter. Well, no. I mean, if you've looked at the grading rubrics, you know how impactful the introduction and conclusion can be. So make sure you put a strong speaker for that. So hopefully you have learned a little bit about group presentations, managing conflict, and how to deliver your group presentation. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And if not, I look forward to watching your group presentation soon.